So, or the YouTube recording. So, hello everybody on there. Um, anyway, a few things to talk about before we really get going with notes and everything. Just as a reminder, your Decades project is due today. I hope you guys have been working on that a whole bunch and are done or close to done. I know I've gotten a bunch turned in, and that's really awesome to see. But on that note, I've also seen a pretty regular request from a few people as they want to be able to share those or present those. And while that may not be entirely possible for everybody to present for everybody, because we only have a limited amount of time, we don't want to have to go through hours and hours of that mandatory of having everybody here. But I want to make sure you guys have the chance to do that. So today, if you would like, you can choose to attend a Zoom meeting that we're going to do at 2:45. I'll talk about this again during our homeroom Zoom. So if you hear me talk about it again, that's what I'm doing. At 2:45, you are more than welcome to join us there to present your presentation, go through it, play music, and show us what we've done, because I have seen some incredible presentations so far. I know I'm really, really well done. I love how some of you guys have been able to get into the decade that you guys are highlighting. Some awesome ones on the 50s and the 80s and everything in between, really. It's been just so great to see. Now, it is not mandatory to do so. It is also not mandatory if you show up. You don't even have to show your presentation if you don't want to. If you want to show up at 2:45, hang out with your friends, and just kind of watch everybody else's presentation and listen to some music from, the 80s or whatever, you are more than welcome to do so. I highly encourage it. It should be kind of fun. We could talk, we can, chat and stuff in between, and just have a nice time for everybody to share what they've done. We're not going to, worry too much about, getting everything else turned in at that time. So if you're not done yet and you still want to show up and kind of hang out, you are more than welcome to do so. Gage, Mary, make sure you're commenting in the correct live stream thread. It's not a big deal, but so if you're almost done with it and you want to finish it up and you want to make sure you're ready to show it there, just get that done beforehand. You have a little bit of time, obviously, between now and the Zoom meeting at 1:30. Then you'll have Ms. Schleicher's ELAR meeting, and then you'll have mine. So if you'd like to show up for that, that's totally awesome. Again, you don't have to show your presentation if you don't want to, if you show up, but it could just, I don't know how many people for sure want to. I know I've had a few people who've definitely expressed interest. So that's just what I'm going to be what I'm going to do, so you guys have that opportunity. Otherwise, I've seen some, as I was saying, I've seen so far what I've seen turned in has been pretty good. I haven't obviously graded any of it yet. I'm going to get working on that starting tomorrow. But make sure you get those turned in. I know a few people have put less than, I have not been putting the effort in to get that, to make sure you're getting that done yet. Get it done as best you can. If you could get it turned in today, that's awesome. If not, then get it turned in by this weekend, and that'd be great. And remember, don't rush to get this turned in, because if you turn it in, if you're like, oh, well, I forgot to do that, I'll do it in, the span of a few minutes, and you turn it in and it's not acceptable, then you're going to have to redo the whole thing. So just keep that in mind. I don't anticipate that being a serious issue, but if you rush through it, then that might be what happens. You should know what is acceptable at this point and follow the rubric if you have any questions. If you have any other additional questions for me about that you want to ask, you can also do that during that Zoom time, or you can just, you leave a comment or something and I'll try and get to it. We do get hundreds of emails every single day here. All your 8th grade teachers do. So whether it's, comments left on Google Classroom, things turned in late, or other emails, we get over 100 on a daily basis. So if we accidentally skip through something, do not be afraid to leave the same question if it's been a few hours, or if you left it at night and it's rolled around to morning. Don't feel free to just leave the same question, so you can make sure, at least for me, maybe other teachers not so much. But for me, if you feel like I've forgotten to answer a question, don't be afraid to leave the same thing, because sometimes stuff can just get skipped over on accident, and sometimes we'll get like 5 emails in the span of about 1 minute if we like right after we post something. And that's all throughout the day, by the way. We got emails at like 3 a.m. last night, a whole bunch actually. So that's just what happens. Anyway, sorry about that little tangent, but we're going to get back on track. Last time on Monday, you recall, we talked a little bit about Ronald Reagan. I hope you guys all got a chance to enjoy that sense of humor that he was able to bring to the presidency. Something like that is not always not always appreciated in today's political scene. That's not something that we get to see and we get to laugh with a whole lot. But back then, it was a little bit more of a friendly, casual relationship you could see between the candidates of both parties. Now, of course, people had disagreements, and it's not going to say that there wasn't it wasn't contentious at points, but generally it was a little bit more united on a lot of fronts, and both parties were a little bit closer together than they are today, which is why you ended up seeing a lot of results in elections that were, blowouts, because everybody was pretty comfortable switching from party to party, because you weren't going to get a complete and totally different thing than what you were hoping for. And now there were obviously differences, and they were different ways to view different issues, but they were a little bit more friendly, a little bit more able to work together than we have currently today. And hopefully at some point soon, we can kind of bring that back to, what we used to have, where both parties could work a little bit more hand in hand. It's something that we've been struggling to do even during this whole issue, this whole global pandemic. We still had a lot of political agendas being pushed on both sides, and it gets kind of contentious. Anyway, so Reaganomics. We've talked about a little bit about how these are similar ideas to what we still see today through a lot of the Republican Party. This is what Reagan was famous for, and what the Republican Party then staked its reputation to going forward. Now, obviously, things have changed, but a lot of the same intention, a lot of the same strategies are similar things that are trying to be put in place today. So you can see that intention on the right side there. The idea was to decrease tax rates, which then increased income available for spending or investment from individual people. If you had a little bit more money back in your pocket, you could spend that, you can invest that, help the economy to grow, which is that next thing, that GDP, the gross domestic product, continues to grow for the United States, and that leads to more taxable revenue. So you have a larger tax base, you get more money back, because you're trying to help the economy, which then comes back towards the government. That's the general idea. And, for most part, it did work pretty well. So, as we were saying here, reducing taxes to stimulate economic activity, to give money back in the hands of people, to hopefully they spend it. I'm sure you've heard plenty of news about that $1,200 stimulus check that people have been getting. That is not meant to be just like tucked away and saved. That is meant to be, spent and invested and get the economy back moving. Cutting government spending for the purpose of reducing the federal deficit. You tighten money supply for the sake of controlling inflation. And you deregulate industry for the sake of promoting competition. Hopefully all of these help grow the economy. All of these acts were put into place during Reagan's time in office. And we could see some of the results. So the real GDP, that pink line, you could see that did steadily raise from 81 to 88. And that federal deficit, they were not as easily able to get that under control. It spikes up in the middle years and comes back down to a more reasonable thing. But Reagan was never able to quite get that down closer to zero, like what one of his goals was. And you can say that perhaps if these policies had been continued for a little bit longer, maybe that they would have gotten a bigger tax base. But it wasn't the issue with a lot of tax cuts means the government's not getting enough getting that revenue to really help decrease that. Also, part of that issue was Reagan was spending a lot of money on military spending and things like that. And we'll talk about that in the future. But he was not able to quite get that down, even though the economy definitely boomed and there was a lot of faith in the economy and a lot of people were able to benefit from these policies that he put into place. He was not able to 100% get everything under control. So moving forward. Ooh, let's see. What did we post here? Oh, yes. This is a fun thing to see that William just posted. If you haven't clicked on that yet, it's interesting. Let's see if you can. No, it didn't pull it up. Just a second. This is the U.S. debt clock. As you can see, this is basically trying to keep updated as best as they can. How much debt does the United States have of this moment? And you can see this big number right here. What is that number? What does that even mean? Like, what? How would you say that number in terms of words? In chat, can anybody tell me what that number is? $24 trillion. Yep, 24 trillion, 484 billion, 422 million, on and on and on. Exactly. $24.5 trillion of debt. Just keep that in mind. It's kind of an impossibly large number. It's something that we're obviously clearly having to constantly deal with as the president. The presidents since 2000 have always have had that constantly rising. It's something to keep in mind as we go forward. It's a complicated thing, and you'll talk more about it during your economics class during high school. But it's just it's something you can access anytime and just see how crazy that really is. All right, moving on. Going back here. All right, so the election of 1988. Don't worry, we're not done talking about Reagan by any stretch, but we're going to focus a little bit on Bush and Clinton here, and what they did during their time. So the election in 1988, after Reagan's second term, obviously he was not eligible to run again after they put those laws into place after FDR. But Bush was his vice president throughout this. We took a look at that button that they had with their "Let's Make America Great Again" slogan. And Bush decided he was going to run for president now himself. And obviously he was building off the extreme popularity of Reagan, the great state of the economy at the time, and he was able to win rather easily. You can take a look at that map up in the top right-hand corner. You can see he was able to win most states with just a few holdouts going for the Democratic Michael Dukakis. With Bush in the early debates, Bush decided he wanted to go out there and make a bold promise to Americans, and we're going to take a look at that right here. Don't worry, you'll have plenty of time to write down those notes.
But I'm the one who will not raise taxes. My opponent now says he'll raise them as a last resort or a third resort. But when a politician talks like that, you know that's one resort he'll be checking into. And my opponent won't rule out raising taxes, but I will, and the Congress will push me to raise taxes, and I'll say no. And they'll push, and I'll say no. And they'll push again, and I'll say to them, read my lips. No new taxes.
Famous quote, read my lips, no new taxes. So Reagan had reduced taxes, and Bush went out there promising that he would refused to raise taxes during his term. That right there was during I believe, during the Republican National Convention. And obviously that he staked a lot of his reputation on that, as you can clearly see. Still having people post in the wrong spot. Oh, yeah. Okay. Clearly staking a lot of his reputation on that right there. But, of course, all of the deregulation that had been put into place created a loan crisis, as banks had been making unwise loans and people had been unable to pay them back. We've talked about how that becomes an issue before, during the Great Depression, and the country suffers a minor recession that lasts a decent bit of time. And Bush was basically unable to keep that promise, as the economy was really starting to struggle, and funding for federal programs was not happening. So he ended up raising taxes slightly in 1990, as he came to a compromise with the Democratic controlled Congress, and basically had to go back on what he said. So people felt betrayed, and you had a lot of confidence in the government beginning to decline. And we're going to see how that confidence continues to decline, and how that is affected, and how that affects the elections in the years to come. But Bush's popularity obviously is not very strong anymore. He can no longer stake his reputation on his predecessor Reagan. He's now faced to kind of own up to what he's been able to do while he's in office. He can't say, well, I was with Reagan and look at all these successes. It's now all on him. Obviously, it's a popular thing for some presidential nominees to build on their success of who they were, working with, either as vice president or somewhere underneath. Think about the last two Democratic nominees we've had. Hillary Clinton obviously built on predecessors of both Bill Clinton, and then as Secretary of State under Obama. We have Joe Biden now, who's building off of the popularity of Obama, who he was vice president under, which is always interesting, because during most of Obama's term as president, he was not very popular, but he did have a sharp rise in popularity just in about his last year as president, which was interesting to watch. Anyway, sorry, that's a kind of off topic, but Reagan and Bush, during their time as president, as you know, presidents are responsible for appointing justices to the Supreme Court. We've had a lot of that in the news in the past a few years ago, with some of Trump's who he appointed, and the controversy behind some of those. But during Reagan and Bush's time as president, they managed to appoint 5 new justices to the Supreme Court that flipped a lot of the Supreme Court's decisions more towards the conservative viewpoint. One of those is still actually on the Supreme Court today. I believe that's Clarence Thomas is still on the Supreme Court even now. He was a late Bush appointee, and he's been on there for almost 30 years at this point, I believe. But either way, you could see how that was able to be switched up. And Sandra Day O'Connor, which you could see the picture up there at the top, she becomes the first woman to serve on the Supreme Court, appointed by Reagan. Obviously, now we have we've had several after. I believe there are currently 3 women serving on the Supreme Court. And this is a serious deal. The Supreme Court that responsibility of the president is a reason why people will choose to vote for one party or another. Think about 2016. With Trump being nominated for the Republicans, there were a lot of Republicans who did not have a whole lot of trust or like him a whole lot. They did not necessarily like the way he went about his business. Doesn't necessarily appreciate his presence online. But they decided to stick with the Republican Party because of that job of what the president is responsible for doing, is appointing those justices. it's an important thing to consider when you're voting for president. Is, you know what, that's one of the ways that the president leaves a lasting impact, is who are they going to choose for the Supreme Court. And right now we still have several people serving on the Supreme Court who are getting up there in age. Obviously, Ruth Bader Ginsburg is now approaching 90. We don't know how much longer she's going to be able to serve. So that's something that's going to be switched up in the next few years. And probably after the 2020 election, she's going to retire. So who's going to fill that place? If it's a Republican in the White House, it's going to be somebody who maybe lines up with their views. If it's Democrat, it's going to be somebody who lines up with their views. It's part of what keeps individuals loyal to their political party, even if they don't necessarily love the nominee. It's just something to think about. Do we have homework today? We have the Decades Project due. That's it. I'm not going to give you anything extra. All of the stuff, all of the notes we're taking will come up on a later assignment next week. Or not every single one, but you know what I mean. All right. Moving on to the election of 1992. So as we had talked about, a lot of people started to lose faith in President Bush, and nationwide, they had seen a lot of politicians not necessarily living up to what they're supposed to do. We've dealt with scandal not too much in the past. Nationwide, a lot of people were having trouble believing in established politicians. Obviously, that's something that we still have a pretty strong viewpoint today. Is there's not a ton of faith in established politicians. It's why Trump was partially why Trump was able to win, is he was somebody who was completely coming from the outside. But in 1992, it takes on a completely different face with Ross Perot. Now, if that name seems familiar, he did die just a few years ago, made a lot of news, especially here in Texas. And the reason why he was so famous is partially because he decides to get involved in this election 1992, and then again in 96. He becomes a third-party candidate, basically trying to completely pull away from a lot of Bush and Clinton's viewpoints and do his own kind of different way of thinking. And what was interesting is he mostly just spent a lot of what got him popular was criticism of the established party members, those who had been working in the DNC or RNC for a long time. The national conventions had been part of the establishment, as I've said, going against a lot of that, and eventually he ends up becoming extremely popular. In June of 1992, he actually leads in the polls over both Bush and Clinton in terms of pure numbers. Now, what that causes is he gets a lot more scrutiny from that point forward. That point on, he gets a lot of more pointed questions. He gets asked about specific policies and all of that kind of stuff that is pretty normal for a candidate to be asked. But he doesn't necessarily have as strong of replies, and he kind of falls off in popularity by the time the election comes around. But what his presence has done is it has ensured that a lot of Bush supporters are going to be flipping over to Perot, and certainly Perot didn't just attract Republicans. He got a mix of both. Perhaps he gained a little bit more popularity from would-be Republican voters, and it certainly is enough to sway the election. He ends up winning 19% of the vote, which is a huge amount for a third-party member or a third-party participant, candidate in this race. That is a huge amount for him to be winning. Clinton wins 43%, 38% go to Bush, and you can see the electoral map up here. Clinton is able to win the presidency. Now, former Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton, name that everybody is, I'm sure, very familiar with. He promises more government involvement in areas that have been ignored by Reagan and Bush. He wants to push for better medical coverage for those who can't afford it. He pushes for support for the poor and welfare and things like that. areas that Reagan and Bush had perhaps not funded as much. He wants to kind of go a step in and fix all of that. He also wants to get in there and try and fix a lot of the federal deficit that we had been suffering under. And you had seen that you saw that graph here where it's not where at the end of Reagan's term not able to be fixed quite yet. So Clinton steps in now as the Democratic nominee. And he follows a more middle of the road course for a lot of his time as president. He doesn't go out there and he's not extreme on either side, and kind of tries to work a little bit more in tandem with both parties. He does some things like he increases taxes, reduces spending like he said he would, to lead to a steady decline in the federal deficit. And starting with his term in 93 all the way till 2000, the federal deficit actually begins to steadily decline until the first time in years, by the end, they actually managed to have a budget surplus. Certainly a big victory for Clinton there, as he was able to help with that big issue. He pushes for a reform of the healthcare system, but even with this Congress controlled by Democrats at the beginning of his term, unable to push through his plan. It was not a very popular thing. Obviously, it's a huge issue in today's debates. We talk about healthcare reform and Medicare for all pushed by certain candidates. But at the time, even Democrats were pretty nervous about trying to put something like that in place. It's extremely expensive. It does cost a huge amount of money, so it necessitates raising taxes even to a larger extent. And many Democrats were worried that they would completely lose support if they tried to push this through. And what ends up happening is, the beginning, it kind of stagnates. Clinton's not able to continue to get everything that he wants pushed through. So in 1994, the Republicans actually take both the House and the Senate for the first time since the 1950s, and both sides end up working together from that point forward and accomplish a lot. As we can see, they managed to get the federal deficit completely down to zero, and eventually build up a surplus, and able to continue to have the economy grow at a pretty steady rate throughout most of the 1990s. Newt Gingrich becomes Speaker of the House in I believe that's in 94, or just after that, after the elections come through, and the Republicans end up having to go back and forth with Clinton, and eventually get some important things passed through. And towards the end of Clinton's term, couldn't really talk about his entire thing without talking about his impeachment. Now, as we know, the president has been impeached 3 times. First, Andrew Johnson manages to stay in presidency by 1 vote. Most recently, Trump was just a few months ago, so you probably are at least somewhat familiar with this process. And then the other one would be Bill Clinton. So during Clinton's second term, federal prosecutors decide to investigate him for real estate dealings and possible corruption with those while he was governor of Arkansas. And they continue to investigate, and they do not find any sort of wrongdoing, anything that would, constitute removal from the office. But they did end up finding evidence that he had lied under oath about a relationship with a White House intern. The president had an affair with somebody who worked in the White House as an intern, and obviously that ended up turning into a pretty big scandal. Yes, Jacoby, that's literally what we're talking about right now. I don't want to go into a whole lot more details than that. Yes, Monica Lewinsky, still a name out there, obviously thrown around. So that kind of ends up becoming a big issue, and he ends up getting impeached. So the process here, we've gone through this, and it's important to obviously know because we literally just went through this with Trump as well. So first of all, the House decides to authorize an investigation. They create the committee, the House Judiciary Committee. There it is, to investigate this, and they decide whether or not that there are grounds to continue towards impeachment. So the House has to vote on that, and if you get a simple majority, then that moves on to the Senate. Now, we dealt with that. I believe that vote was in January, and then goes over to the Senate, where then they question individuals involved with with whatever the issue that's being investigated. They continue to they question those. Question the people involved. Oftentimes, they'll even have the president make statements if they feel like that is necessary. And that is, then they hold a trial that is presided over by the Chief Justice, and then they vote on impeachment and basically removal here in this case. Because technically you're impeached if you go to the Senate at that point. It's talking about removal. So if 2/3 vote for conviction, then the president is impeached, or it's impeached and removed from office. In Trump's case, there was when they went to the Senate, the vote wasn't even really close. Same here with Clinton. They decided to acquit him of all charges of the charges, and it was not a close vote necessarily here either. Obviously, the closest we've ever been was the Andrew Johnson thing, which we talked about in the first unit of the year. But with this, Clinton was not exactly very popular anymore. We've talked about with the modern conservative movement, how they they valued things like family and religion and more and a strict sense of morals. Obviously, this did not exactly reflect very well on Clinton, and it reduced a decent bit of his popularity. And whether it's fair or not, I think that's reflected on Hillary Clinton as well in the past few years, as people have not necessarily treated her with the most respect because of some issues like this. Obviously, she has her own issues that we can't necessarily get into, but the kind of thing like this will continue to snowball as we've seen. All right, we could continue if we want. I have a few more slides to get through, but I think this is going to be a decent spot to end for today, since we are going to continue to meet today in the afternoon. I know it's cutting it probably a little shorter, maybe even not even quite half an hour. Do we have any other questions? Would Trump still have that suspension of powers from his impeachment if he wins this year's election? Good question. Don't think so. Any other questions about what we've gone over today? I know people have been spamming stuff in Twitch chat, emotes and the stuff like that. That's great. We've had a hard time keeping in the correct thread, but that's on me. I didn't get on here for a little while. We had a long 8th grade meeting about some stuff that's going to be going on, and DC week and all stuff like that. So if you have any other questions, otherwise I think I'm going to end it here. This next one, End of the Cold War, is lesson 2 of 3. So there's not a whole lot to get through with this unit. I don't know if we're going to get onto unit 17 a whole lot. We may just have a few things that we talk about. That's the end of lesson 1. End of Cold War is lesson 2. So do appreciate the questions. Any other questions for me before we get going? As a reminder, at 2:45 today, we are going to be meeting in the normal Zoom meetup spot. So like the one that we do all of our class meetings in, that's technically my Zoom. So that's where we're going to meet. If you would like to show off your presentations, or if you just want to show up and listen to other people and chat and stuff, that's totally fine. As I said, we just finished lesson 1. End of the Cold War is lesson 2. We'll move on to that on Monday. Probably try and get through the entirety of Unit 16 next week, because then I can move on to Unit 17 and get a few things done, because there's not a ton of time we have left for history classes, honestly. So good to see all of you guys today. Had a whole bunch, upwards of 40 people watching, and I believe most of that's 8th graders. All right. Yes, dog. All right. I'm going to wrap it up there. Bye, YouTube.